Caitlin Clark was not your ordinary journalist. At just 29 years old, she had already made a name for herself as someone who never backed down from tough questions. Her articles were sharp, fearless, and often controversial, tackling issues that others avoided like the plague. Caitlin grew up in a small town in Ohio, but her dreams were anything but small. She wanted to make a difference through her words, and she believed the best way to do that was by challenging authority and exposing uncomfortable truths. On a chilly November morning, Caitlin woke up late after pulling an all-nighter working on a story about corporate corruption. She shuffled into her tiny apartment's kitchen, poured herself a cup of lukewarm coffee, and opened her laptop. The inbox was flooded with emails, most of them spam or pitches from PR agencies. But one email stood out. It was from the Vatican. Caitlin blinked twice, thinking she must be hallucinating from lack of sleep. But no, it was real. The subject line read, "Exclusive interview request, His Holiness, Pope Francis." Caitlin's heart skipped a beat. Why would the Vatican want her? Sure, she had built a reputation for being bold and unapologetic, but this invitation seemed almost surreal. Maybe they didn't know about her track record of calling out powerful institutions. Or maybe they did, and they wanted to see how far she'd go. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she clicked open the email. It was formal, yet warm, inviting her to the Vatican for an exclusive interview with Pope Francis. They praised her work, saying they admired her dedication to uncovering important truths. Caitlin felt a mix of excitement and skepticism. Was this some kind of trick? A test? Or was it genuinely an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation with one of the most influential figures in the world? She spent hours pacing around her apartment, debating whether to accept. On one hand, this could be the biggest break of her career, a chance to ask the hard questions and hold even the highest levels of power accountable. On the other hand, going toe-to-toe with the leader of the Catholic Church wasn't something to take lightly. Still, Caitlin wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. By midnight, she had drafted her response. I accept. Over the next few weeks, Caitlin threw herself into preparation. She knew this wouldn't be an ordinary interview. This was Pope Francis, the man who had spoken out against climate change, poverty, and inequality, earning admiration from millions worldwide. But Caitlin also knew there were darker sides to the Catholic Church, issues like sexual abuse scandals, resistance to modern values, and accusations of hypocrisy regarding its immense wealth. If she wanted to make this interview count, she needed to dig deep. She started by reading everything she could find about Pope Francis. Biographies, speeches, interviews. He became her obsession. She learned about his humble beginnings in Argentina, his advocacy for the poor, and his progressive stances on social justice. Yet she also uncovered criticisms leveled against him, both from within and outside the church. Caitlin compiled pages upon pages of notes, organizing them into categories: environment, gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, financial transparency, and more. But research alone wasn't enough. Caitlin wanted to prepare emotionally too. She imagined countless scenarios. What if he refused to answer certain questions? What if he grew defensive? What if she crossed a line and offended him? She rehearsed potential responses in front of her bathroom mirror, trying to strike the right balance between assertiveness and respect. As the days passed, Caitlin began to feel a strange mix of confidence and dread. She knew this interview could define her career or ruin it. One wrong move and she might alienate billions of Catholics. But one brave question could spark a global conversation. The stakes were high, and Caitlin thrived under pressure. Finally, the day came for her to leave for Rome. Standing at the airport with her suitcase in hand, Caitlin couldn't help but wonder what awaited her. Would Pope Francis live up to his reputation as a compassionate reformer? Or would he reveal himself to be another figurehead clinging to outdated traditions? Either way, Caitlin was ready. She had done her homework, sharpened her arguments, and fortified her resolve. Little did she know this trip to the Vatican would lead to one of the most unforgettable encounters of her life. An exchange that would test her beliefs, challenge her courage, and ultimately leave the world talking. Caitlin stepped off the plane in Rome, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. The city was buzzing with energy. Street vendors calling out to tourists, the scent of fresh pasta wafting through the air, and the distant hum of Vespas, weaving through narrow cobblestone streets. But Caitlin barely noticed any of it. Her mind was consumed by one thing: the interview that awaited her inside the walls of the Vatican. After checking into her hotel, she spent the evening reviewing her notes one last time. Each question felt heavier than the last. Would she really ask Pope Francis about the wealth of the Vatican? About the Church's handling of sexual abuse scandals? About its stance on women and LGBTQ+ rights? She knew these topics were sensitive, but she also believed they needed to be addressed. This wasn't just about her career. It was about holding powerful institutions accountable, even if it meant stepping into uncomfortable territory. The next morning, Caitlin dressed carefully, choosing a simple yet professional outfit: black slacks, a crisp white blouse, and a blazer. She wanted to look respectful but confident. As she stood outside the Vatican gates clutching her notebook and recorder, she couldn't help but feel small. The sheer size and grandeur of the place were overwhelming. Towering statues loomed overhead, and golden mosaics shimmered in the sunlight. It was hard not to feel intimidated. A Vatican official greeted her warmly and escorted her through the labyrinthine hallways. Caitlin tried to take everything in: the intricate frescoes, the ornate chandeliers, the quiet reverence of the space. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the upcoming interview. What would Pope Francis be like in person? Would he be as warm and approachable as people said, or would he be guarded and formal? She didn't have long to wait. When Caitlin entered the room where the interview was to take place, she was struck by its simplicity. Unlike the rest of the Vatican, this space was modest: a wooden desk, 2 chairs, and a small table holding a glass of water. Pope Francis sat there, smiling gently as she approached. He rose to greet her, extending his hand. "Miss Clark," he said in accented English, "it is a pleasure to meet you." Caitlin shook his hand, surprised by how firm yet gentle his grip was. Up close, he looked older than she expected, with deep lines etched into his face and a warmth in his eyes that put her slightly at ease. "Thank you for having me, Your Holiness," she replied, taking her seat across from him. For the first few minutes, the conversation flowed smoothly. Pope Francis asked about her journey to Rome and complimented her work. Caitlin found herself relaxing, almost forgetting the weight of the questions she had prepared. They began discussing global issues like poverty and climate change, topics Caitlin knew he cared deeply about. His answers were thoughtful and passionate, filled with references to scripture and personal anecdotes from his time in Argentina. But Caitlin couldn't let herself get too comfortable. She reminded herself why she was here, not just to exchange pleasantries, but to challenge him, to push beyond the surface-level answers. Taking a deep breath, she decided to dive in. "Your Holiness," she began, leaning forward slightly, "you've spoken extensively about caring for the poor and marginalized. That's something many people admire about you. But critics often point to the immense wealth of the Vatican itself, the priceless art, the gold-adorned ceilings, the vast financial assets, and argue that it contradicts your message. How do you respond to accusations that the Church isn't practicing what it preaches?" The room fell silent for a moment. Pope Francis's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of contemplation. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, but carried a hint of defensiveness. "The Church has always been a steward of beauty and history," he explained. "Much of what you see here was entrusted to us by generations past. And while we may appear wealthy, much of our resources are dedicated to charitable works, feeding the hungry, educating children, providing health care to those in need." Caitlin nodded, jotting down his response, but she wasn't ready to let the matter drop. "I understand that, Your Holiness," she said, "but some might argue that selling off some of these treasures could fund even more charitable efforts. Isn't there a moral obligation to use all available resources to help those in dire need?" Pope Francis paused again, his expression softening. "There is wisdom in balancing preservation and progress," he said slowly. We must honor our heritage while striving to serve humanity. It's a delicate balance. Though his answer seemed reasonable, Caitlin sensed an opportunity to dig deeper. She shifted gears, moving on to another contentious topic. What about the issue of transparency within the church? She asked. Many people feel frustrated by what they perceive as secrecy or resistance to accountability, especially when it comes to financial matters. Do you think the church could do more to open itself up to scrutiny? This time, Pope Francis leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. Transparency is important, he admitted, and we are working toward greater openness. But change takes time, especially in an institution as ancient as ours. Trust must be earned step by step. Caitlin listened intently, noting the careful phrasing of his responses. She appreciated his willingness to engage with her questions, but she also recognized the diplomatic nature of his answers. There was still so much ground to cover, and she knew the real test lay ahead. As the interview continued, Caitlin found herself torn between admiration and frustration. On one hand, Pope Francis's sincerity was undeniable. He truly seemed to care about making the world a better place. On the other hand, his answers often skirted around the tougher realities, leaving her with more questions than answers. Still, she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth beneath the polished exterior. By the end of their initial conversation, both Caitlin and Pope Francis appeared reflective. The atmosphere had shifted subtly, from casual discussion to something more serious, more charged. Caitlin realized she was tiptoeing along the edge of a precipice, knowing that her next set of questions could either deepen their dialogue or spark outright conflict. Either way, she was ready. The interview had started off cordially enough, but Caitlin could feel the tension building. Pope Francis's calm demeanor masked a growing unease as her questions became more pointed. She knew she was treading on sensitive ground now, but that didn't stop her. If anything, it fueled her determination to push further. Taking a deep breath, Caitlin decided to tackle one of the most controversial topics head-on: the Catholic Church's handling of sexual abuse scandals. Your Holiness, she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the question. The Church has faced immense criticism over its response to cases of clergy sexual abuse. Many victims and their families feel betrayed by how these situations were mishandled for decades. What steps is the Church taking to ensure accountability and prevent such abuses from happening again? Pope Francis's expression darkened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed her words. For a moment there was silence, a heavy pause that seemed to stretch endlessly. Then in a measured tone he replied, We have made mistakes, grave mistakes, and I deeply regret the pain caused to those who trusted us. As a church, we are committed to protecting the vulnerable and ensuring justice for survivors. We have implemented stricter protocols, increased transparency, and worked closely with law enforcement to address these crimes. Caitlin nodded, jotting down his response, but she wasn't satisfied. Forgive me, Your Holiness, she said, leaning forward slightly. But many critics argue that while efforts have been made, they aren't enough. Some bishops accused of covering up abuse still hold positions of power, and some survivors feel their voices are being ignored. How can the Church regain trust when actions seem inconsistent with words? Pope Francis sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the topic. Change does not happen overnight, he said. It requires time, patience, and humility. But I assure you we are listening. Every victim deserves justice, and every survivor deserves healing. This is a priority for me personally. Though his answer carried sincerity, Caitlin couldn't ignore the contradictions she had uncovered during her research. She pressed on, unwilling to let the matter drop. But isn't it true that some dioceses continue to resist reforms? She asked. And what about the Vatican's reluctance to release full records related to these cases? Doesn't that undermine claims of transparency? This time, Pope Francis's composure faltered just a little. His jaw tightened and his gaze sharpened. Releasing documents is complicated, he admitted. There are legal considerations, privacy concerns, and the need to protect innocent parties. But wherever possible, we strive to cooperate fully with investigations. Caitlin sensed she was hitting a nerve. but she also realized this was the moment to push harder. She shifted gears, moving to another divisive issue, the Church's stance on LGBTQ+ rights. "Your Holiness," she said, choosing her words carefully, "you've spoken about the importance of compassion and inclusion. Yet many members of the LGBTQ+ community feel rejected by the Church's teachings, which defines same-sex relationships as sinful. How do you reconcile this message of love with policies that marginalize so many people?" Pope Francis leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his tone was softer, almost weary. "The Church teaches what it believes to be God's truth," he explained. "But that doesn't mean we should turn away anyone seeking Christ's love. Everyone is welcome in the Church, no exceptions." "That may be true," Caitlin countered gently but firmly. "But many LGBTQ+ individuals say they don't feel welcome at all. They see the Church's teachings as exclusionary and hurtful. Do you think it's time for the Church to reconsider its position on this issue?" For the first time since the interview began, Pope Francis hesitated visibly. He looked away briefly, staring out the window before turning back to Caitlin. "The Church evolves slowly," he said finally. "Our teachings are rooted in centuries of tradition, and change cannot come without careful reflection. But I believe dialogue is essential. We must listen to those who feel excluded and seek ways to bridge divides." Caitlin scribbled furiously in her notebook, capturing every word. She appreciated his willingness to engage, but she couldn't help feeling frustrated by the lack of concrete answers. She decided to bring up yet another contentious topic, the role of women in the Church. "Your Holiness," she said, her tone sharp but respectful, "women make up a significant portion of the Church's followers, yet they remain excluded from leadership roles, including priesthood. Why hasn't the Church moved toward greater gender equality?" Pope Francis exhaled deeply, clearly aware of the complexity of the question. "This is a deeply theological issue," he responded. "The Church's teachings on ordination are based on scripture and tradition. However, I agree that women play a vital role in our faith and deserve greater recognition and opportunities within the Church." "But isn't that exactly the problem?" Caitlin interjected. "Women want more than lip service, they want real representation. How can the Church claim to value equality when half its members are systematically excluded from decision-making?" At this point, the room crackled with tension. Pope Francis's face hardened ever so slightly, though his voice remained calm. "Miss Clark," he said, "the Church is not perfect. It struggles with human limitations and sin. But we are called to serve God faithfully, even when that means grappling with difficult truths. Change will come, but it must honor our beliefs and unity." Caitlin felt a surge of frustration bubbling inside her. She wanted to scream, to demand immediate action, but she reminded herself to stay composed. Instead, she posed one final, loaded question. "Your Holiness, critics often accuse the Church of hypocrisy, preaching love and compassion while clinging to outdated practices that alienate millions. What would you say to someone who feels disillusioned by the gap between your words and actions?" Pope Francis stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I would tell them that no institution is without flaws," he said quietly. "Even the Church is made up of imperfect people trying to follow a perfect God. But we are called to strive for holiness, to repent when we fail, and to keep moving forward. Faith is not about perfection. It's about hope." The air in the room felt thick with unspoken emotions. Caitlin realized she had pushed as far as she dared, for now. Both she and Pope Francis sat in silence, each reflecting on the intensity of their exchange. Though neither had emerged victorious, both had revealed vulnerabilities rarely seen in public. As they paused to collect themselves, Caitlin felt a strange sense of admiration for Pope Francis. Despite their differences, she recognized his genuine desire to lead with compassion. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that good intentions weren't enough, not when lives were at stake. Little did Caitlin know this heated debate would only be the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of the Vatican. The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Both Caitlin and Pope Francis sat still, their eyes locked in a quiet standoff. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Caitlin's heart raced as she replayed the last few minutes in her mind. Had she gone too far? Was it possible to have pushed harder without crossing a line? She glanced at Pope Francis, whose expression had softened slightly, but remained contemplative. His hands rested on the table, fingers interlaced as though he were praying silently. Finally, Pope Francis broke the silence. "Miss Clark," he said, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "You ask difficult questions because you care deeply about justice. I respect that, but I must remind you, change within the church is not always swift or visible. It requires patience, faith, and trust." Caitlin nodded slowly, acknowledging his point, but she couldn't let go of her frustration. "Your Holiness," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "I understand the importance of tradition and patience, but when people are suffering, when survivors of abuse feel abandoned, when LGBTQ+ individuals feel rejected, when women feel excluded, they don't have the luxury of waiting. For them, every day without action feels like another betrayal. How can they be expected to wait indefinitely?" Pope Francis sighed, leaning back in his chair. He looked older in that moment, the weight of his responsibilities etched into his face. "It's true," he admitted, "that the church has caused pain, and I take responsibility for that. But we cannot simply abandon our teachings or dismantle centuries of doctrine overnight. Doing so would fracture the very foundation of our faith." "But isn't it also true," Caitlin countered, her voice rising slightly, "that clinging to outdated practices risks alienating millions of believers? Many young Catholics today feel disconnected from the church precisely because its teachings no longer align with modern values. If the church doesn't adapt, it risks becoming irrelevant." For the first time during the interview, Pope Francis smiled, a faint, almost wistful smile. "Ah, Miss Clark," he said, shaking his head gently, "you speak as though relevance is the ultimate goal. But the church does not exist to conform to the world. It exists to transform it. Our mission is spiritual, not political. We guide souls toward eternal life, not fleeting trends." Caitlin leaned forward, her pen poised above her notebook. "But isn't spirituality meant to reflect the needs of the times?" she asked. "If the church refuses to listen to the cries of its own followers, the poor, the marginalized, the excluded, how can it claim to be a beacon of hope?" Pope Francis tilted his head, considering her question. "Hope is not always easy to see," he said softly. "Sometimes it hides behind struggle and sacrifice. The church walks alongside those who suffer, offering comfort and guidance. But we cannot compromise our core beliefs for the sake of convenience or popularity." Caitlin felt a surge of irritation. She understood his perspective, but it seemed so detached from reality. How could someone preach love and compassion while defending systems that perpetuated exclusion? Still, she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't just about winning an argument, it was about finding common ground. "Let me ask you this," she said, her tone softer now. "Do you believe the church has made mistakes? Real, significant mistakes that require more than apologies or promises of reform?" Pope Francis hesitated before answering. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of vulnerability. "Yes," he said simply. "We have failed many times. In how we treated victims of abuse, in how we responded to social changes, in how we communicated God's love to all people. These failures haunt us, and they should. They remind us that we are human, prone to error. But they also drive us to seek redemption." His honesty caught Caitlin off guard. She hadn't expected him to admit fault so openly. For a brief moment, she saw past the robes and titles to the man beneath, a leader burdened by immense challenges yet determined to serve. It didn't erase her criticisms, but it gave her pause. "And what about moving forward?" she pressed. "What concrete steps can the church take to rebuild trust and address these issues meaningfully?" Pope Francis straightened in his seat, his expression growing resolute. We will continue listening, to victims, to critics, to those who feel unheard. We will strengthen safeguards against abuse, promote dialogue on divisive topics, and work tirelessly to ensure that everyone feels welcomed in the church. But this is not a task for one person or even one generation. It is a collective effort, guided by prayer and humility. Caitlin scribbled furiously in her notebook, capturing every word. Though his answers weren't perfect, they revealed a willingness to engage with criticism, an openness she hadn't anticipated. Still, she couldn't help but wonder if it would translate into real change. As the conversation continued, Caitlin decided to shift gears slightly. She wanted to explore whether Pope Francis truly believed in the possibility of progress, or if he viewed certain issues as non-negotiable. "Your Holiness," she began, "is there anything the Church absolutely cannot compromise on? Any teaching or tradition that is untouchable, no matter how much pressure there is to change?" Pope Francis thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There are truths rooted in Scripture and apostolic tradition that define who we are as Catholics," he said finally. "These are not negotiable. But how we apply those truths in the modern world, that is where discernment comes in. We must balance fidelity to our faith with compassion for humanity." Caitlin nodded, sensing that this was as close to an admission of flexibility as she was likely to get. She decided to wrap up the discussion with one final pointed question. "So, Your Holiness, if someone watching this interview feels disillusioned with the Church, whether because of its handling of abuse, its stance on LGBTQ+ rights, or its treatment of women, what would you say to them?" Pope Francis leaned forward, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I would tell them this: the Church is imperfect because it is made up of imperfect people, but it is also holy because it carries Christ's message of love and salvation. If you feel hurt or excluded, I am sorry. Please know that your pain matters to us. Stay close to God, and together, we will find a way forward." The sincerity in his voice struck Caitlin deeply. Though she disagreed with many aspects of the Church's teachings, she couldn't deny the authenticity of his words. In that moment, she realized something profound. This debate wasn't just about right versus wrong. It was about two fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. When the interview concluded, both Caitlin and Pope Francis stood and shook hands. There was no animosity between them, only a mutual respect forged through honest dialogue. As Caitlin walked out of the Vatican, her mind buzzed with thoughts and emotions. She knew this encounter would spark conversations far beyond the walls of the Church, and perhaps that was the most important outcome of all. As Caitlin stepped out of the Vatican into the bright Roman sunlight, she felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her. The interview was over, but its impact lingered heavily in her mind. Her head buzzed with fragments of their heated debate, the sharp exchanges, the moments of vulnerability, and the unspoken tension that had filled the room. For someone who thrived on asking tough questions, this experience felt different. It wasn't just another story. It was personal. Walking back to her hotel, Caitlin replayed the conversation in her mind. Pope Francis's answers had been thoughtful, even compassionate at times, yet they often seemed to sidestep the deeper issues. He spoke of patience and tradition, of balancing faith with humanity, but Caitlin couldn't shake the feeling that these explanations fell short for those who needed immediate action. Still, there was something about him, an authenticity that made her question her own assumptions. Was he truly resistant to change, or was he navigating a delicate path between progress and preservation? Back in her hotel room, Caitlin sat by the window, staring out at the bustling streets below. She pulled out her notebook and flipped through the pages, reviewing her notes. Each question she had asked represented a challenge, a demand for accountability. But now, looking back, she realized how complex the answers were. The Catholic Church wasn't just an institution, it was a living organism, shaped by centuries of history, culture, and belief. Change wouldn't come easily, and perhaps that was part of the problem. For the first time, Caitlin allowed herself to consider Pope Francis's perspective. Yes, the Church had flaws, major ones, but it also had millions of followers who genuinely believed in its mission. To them, the church wasn't just a building or a set of rules, it was a source of hope, community, and spiritual guidance. Could she fault Pope Francis for trying to protect that while addressing criticism? It was a balancing act few leaders could manage effectively. But then again, Caitlin reminded herself why she had pursued journalism in the first place: to give voice to the voiceless, to hold power accountable. And she knew that many people felt abandoned by the very institution meant to care for them. Survivors of abuse, LGBTQ+ Catholics, women seeking equality. They weren't asking for perfection. They were asking for acknowledgement and action. If the church couldn't meet them halfway, what hope did they have? Her thoughts drifted to Pope Francis himself. Despite their disagreements, Caitlin couldn't deny his sincerity. He hadn't dodged her questions entirely. Instead, he had engaged with them, even when they were uncomfortable. His willingness to admit mistakes and express regret was rare among world leaders. Perhaps, Caitlin thought, that was why so many admired him. He wasn't perfect, but he was human. And maybe that was enough for some people. Still, Caitlin wrestled with her own role in all of this. Had she pushed too hard, or not hard enough? Journalists like her often walked a fine line between advocacy and objectivity. On one hand, she wanted to expose injustices and spark change. On the other hand, she knew that meaningful dialogue required empathy and understanding. This interview had tested both sides of that balance, leaving her unsure of where she stood. The next morning, Caitlin decided to explore Rome before heading back to New York. She wandered through cobblestone streets, past ancient ruins and vibrant piazzas, letting the city's energy distract her from her racing thoughts. At one point, she found herself standing outside a small church tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Curiosity got the better of her, and she stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with soft candlelight flickering against stone walls. A few elderly women knelt in prayer, their heads bowed reverently. Caitlin hesitated for a moment, feeling out of place, but then she took a seat near the back. She didn't pray. She wasn't religious, but she closed her eyes and let the stillness wash over her. In that moment, she understood why so many people turned to the church for solace. It wasn't about grand cathedrals or elaborate rituals. It was about finding peace in chaos, meaning in uncertainty. When Caitlin returned to her hotel later that day, she opened her laptop and began drafting her article. Writing always helped her process her thoughts, and this time was no different. As she typed, she focused not just on the facts of the interview, but on the emotions behind it, the passion, the frustration, the shared humanity. She wanted readers to see beyond the headlines and understand the complexity of the issues at hand. In her piece, Caitlin highlighted both sides of the debate. She praised Pope Francis for his openness and humility, acknowledging the challenges he faced as a leader, torn between tradition and modernity. But she also called out the areas where the church continued to fall short, urging it to take bolder steps toward accountability and inclusion. Her tone was firm but fair, critical yet compassionate, a reflection of her own journey during this experience. By the time she finished writing, Caitlin felt a sense of clarity. She hadn't resolved every question in her mind, but she had gained a deeper appreciation for the nuances of leadership and faith. Pope Francis wasn't a villain, nor was he a savior. He was simply a man doing his best to navigate an imperfect world, a reminder that even the most powerful figures were human after all. As she boarded the plane back to New York, Caitlin glanced out the window at the sprawling city of Rome one last time. She knew this interview would spark intense reactions, praise, criticism, debate, but she also knew it was worth it. Sometimes the most important stories weren't about finding answers. They were about starting conversations. And, for Caitlin, that was enough. When Caitlin's article hit the internet, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, her interview with Pope Francis became the talk of the town, not just in Rome or New York, but across the globe. Social media platforms lit up with reactions. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, and debates erupted everywhere from living rooms to lecture halls. People couldn't stop talking about it. For some, Caitlin was a hero, a fearless journalist who dared to challenge one of the most powerful figures in the world. They praised her for shining a light on the church's shortcomings and giving a voice to those who felt marginalized. Finally, someone is holding them accountable, one commenter wrote. Others, however, accused her of being disrespectful and overly aggressive. She went too far, another tweeted. You don't attack someone like the Pope. Caitlin scrolled through the comments late at night, her phone glowing in the dark. She expected backlash, but the sheer volume of responses caught her off guard. Some messages were supportive, thanking her for asking the tough questions. Others were harsh, calling her biased or even anti-religious. Despite the criticism, Caitlin felt no regret. This was exactly what she had hoped for. An open, honest conversation that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. Meanwhile, Pope Francis faced his own wave of reactions. Supporters defended him, applauding his calm demeanor and willingness to engage with criticism. Critics, however, argued that he hadn't gone far enough in addressing the issues Caitlin raised. Inside the Vatican, there were whispers of concern. Some cardinals worried that the interview had painted the church in a negative light, while others believed it showed courage and transparency. But Pope Francis himself remained unfazed. In a subsequent address to journalists, he acknowledged the controversy surrounding the interview. Dialogue is never easy, he said, standing before a crowd of reporters. It requires honesty, humility, and a willingness to listen, even when we disagree. I welcome these conversations because they push us to grow, to reflect, and to serve better. His words resonated with many, including Caitlin. Watching the speech online, she felt a flicker of pride. Though their perspectives differed, she admired his ability to embrace criticism rather than shy away from it. It was a rare quality in any leader, let alone one as influential as the Pope. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from the interview continued to unfold. Religious scholars weighed in, analyzing every word exchanged between Caitlin and Pope Francis. Activists seized the opportunity to amplify their calls for reform within the church. Even politicians joined the discussion, debating the role of religion in modern society. The ripple effect was undeniable. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement. For Caitlin, the aftermath brought both opportunities and challenges. Her inbox flooded with interview requests from major networks, eager to hear her side of the story. She appeared on several talk shows where hosts grilled her about her intentions and methods. Did she think she'd changed anything? Was she prepared for the backlash? Each question pushed her to articulate not only her views but also her motivations. I didn't go into this hoping to win an argument, Caitlin explained during one appearance. I wanted to start a conversation, a real, honest dialogue about the role of institutions like the church in today's world. If my questions made people uncomfortable, good. Sometimes discomfort is necessary for growth. Her candor won over skeptics, earning her newfound respect in journalistic circles. Editors praised her for tackling such a sensitive topic with professionalism and empathy. Awards committees began considering her work for recognition, and invitations poured in from universities and conferences around the world. Caitlin's career skyrocketed overnight, but she refused to let success distract her from her mission. Behind the scenes, Caitlin grappled with the personal toll of the experience. While she thrived under pressure, the constant scrutiny took its toll. Friends noticed she seemed more introspective, quieter than usual. Late at night, she often found herself reflecting on the bigger picture. Had the interview truly made a difference, or had it simply stirred the pot without leading to meaningful change? One evening, Caitlin received an unexpected email. It was from a woman named Maria, a survivor of clergy sexual abuse who had read Caitlin's article. Maria thanked her for giving a platform to survivors and for challenging the church to do better. Your questions gave me hope, Maria wrote. They reminded me that we're not forgotten. Reading Maria's words brought tears to Caitlin's eyes. For all the noise and debate, this was what mattered most. The individuals whose lives were touched by the conversation. It wasn't about headlines or accolades. It was about creating space for voices that had long been silenced. Inspired by Maria's message, Caitlin decided to expand her focus. She began working on a series of articles highlighting stories of resilience and activism within marginalized communities, from LGBTQ+ Catholics advocating for inclusion to women fighting for leadership roles in the church. Caitlin sought out narratives of courage and determination. Her goal was simple: to remind readers that change, though slow, was possible. Pope Francis too kept moving forward. In the months following the interview, he addressed several of the issues Caitlin had raised. He announced new initiatives aimed at preventing abuse, increased funding for programs supporting vulnerable populations, and called for greater inclusivity within the church. While critics argued that these steps were insufficient, others saw them as signs of progress, a testament to the power of dialogue. Though Caitlin and Pope Francis never met again, their paths remained intertwined. Both continued to champion causes they believed in, driven by a shared commitment to justice and compassion. Caitlin's journalism evolved, blending sharp critique with heartfelt storytelling. Pope Francis's leadership deepened, marked by moments of reflection and action. In the end, neither emerged unchanged. Caitlin's encounter with Pope Francis taught her the value of listening alongside questioning, of balancing criticism with empathy. And Pope Francis, confronted with unflinching honesty, demonstrated the importance of humility and openness in leadership. Years later, when Caitlin looked back on the interview, she realized its true significance lay not in the answers it provided, but in the questions it sparked. Conversations about faith, tradition, and progress weren't easy. They rarely were. But they were essential, and sometimes the act of asking itself was enough to inspire change.